Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Baruch Hashem, everything is fine here.
Baruch
What's it
Hashem.
like at the other end?
Baruch Hashem, it's getting colder.
Getting colder. No white stuff yet.
Oh no, not yet.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. So it's 10 o'clock in the evening.
Yes, it is. By you,
Wow.
yes, it is.
Wow. You don't mind giving a class so late.
It's my pleasure. Thank
Very kind of you.
you, guys. How's your week been?
Baruch Hashem has been very nice, and I had actually a very beautiful Shabbat at Beth Midrash. It doesn't always work out when anybody's there, but yeah, it was very nice.
Oh, Baruch Hashem, that's wonderful.
Yes, I occasionally stay with some friends, and then I can go to Beth Midrash. They're just on 27th, just behind that Safeway there. So it's not too long a walk. But
That's just around where the rabbi's house is. I stayed by the rabbi's house a few times when I was there.
Rabbi Berger?
Rabbi, the official house of the rabbi for Bet Midrash is on West 27th.
Okay, yes. So it's just is it on the corner of Oak then?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay. So basically, yes, basically just cross the road and round the corner, and yes. Yes, yes, yes. I have to find out ahead of time whenever you're going to visit, because it would be good to coordinate and not just be a haphazard trip into
Of
Vancouver.
course, of course.
So yeah, yes.
Wonderful.
Um, yeah, everything turned another year older, had beautiful phone calls from US, Canada, Sri
Oh,
Lanka,
oh wow,
Israel.
Mazal tov, Mabruk, Ad Me'eve Stream. That's
Amen,
wonderful.
amen, amen. Thank you, thank you. So it was very nice. It was very nice. Yes, thank you.
Baruch Hashem, that's great. Okay, anyone else? I'm wondering if someone else is joining us. Oh, there we are. There's
Yes,
Shmuel.
good. Some more people.
Wonderful. Good evening, Shmuel. How are you?
All good. Baruch Hashem, Rabbi. How are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay, should we get started or wait a couple more minutes? What would you like to do?
It's up to you, Rabbi. It's just 7:01, so
Okay. I guess we'll give it another minute and then I guess we'll get started.
for sure.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, good. Okay, good.
We have to remember at 7 p.m. there's a class. I wasn't sure last week, and I was looking for a separate email that said a Zoom class. I didn't quite understand Dina's process. And I checked too early, so there was nothing. And the
Yeah.
next morning I checked it and it says class starts in an hour. I'm like, oh no.
Oh no.
But she sent me the recording on the YouTube.
Okay, that's wonderful. Okay,
So,
I
but
understand that. I know usually Meyer gives, he gives the 1 hour warning and he gives during the day. So I'm not sure if he's around these days or maybe he's out of town. I don't know, but
no,
I
he
know
was,
there was.
yeah, he was here. He was here for Shabbat anyway.
Okay, okay, wonderful. Baruch Hashem, good. Okay. All right, so I guess we'll get started and we'll take
For
it slow
sure.
and join. Okay, so this evening, welcome, Bruchim Baim. We're going to continue in our classes on kashrut and healthy eating, and today, this evening, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of kosher milk and Chalav Israel. We're going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of some technical technicalities here and specifications, especially with different types of gemarot and opinions, and that'll sort of help us to navigate through this through the seas of understanding the importance of kosher milk in general and how it applies to us today. Okay, so we'll get started. So the question is every milk kosher? And the Gemara that tells us in Masechet Bechorot on page 6b or Vav Amud Bet that milk from a non-kosher animal is forbidden. And the overall term the Gemara says is kol hayotze min hatameh tameh. Whatever comes out of that which is impure is impure. Kol hayotze min hatahor tahor. Whatever comes out of that which is pure, out of an animal that is considered a pure animal or a kosher animal is considered kosher. And in addition to that, the Torah tells us when it gives us prohibitions about foods that meat that we can eat, food that we cannot eat. It mentions the gamal, the camel, and it mentions it twice. Once in Vayikra and once in Devarim, and so the mention specifically of the camel twice gives us the understanding, according to our Chachamim, that one is to prohibit the actual consumption of the camel, which is a non-kosher animal, cannot eat it, and also to prohibit its milk, and that's why it's mentioned twice. That's what's there to teach us. So far we understand that the milk of a non-kosher animal is not permitted. Okay, so the question is, where does this whole Chalav Yisrael subject start? So the Talmud, the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah on page 35b, Lamed He Amud Bet, tells us that there are a number of things that made by Gentile nations that one is not allowed to eat, and one may not be forbidden to derive benefit from them as well. And the first item listed in the Gemara is, and I quote, "Chalav shechalavo oved kochavim ve'en Israel ro'ehu," milk that was milked by a non-Jew, which a Jew did not see at the time that the cow was milked. Okay, so it's officially listed in the Gemara as the first thing that one cannot derive any benefit from or consume. So this milk, says the Mishnah, is something which is forbidden to us. So now the question is, why? Why is it forbidden to us? Continues the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, tells us, and it asks, what is the problem with drinking the milk of non-Jews? So what is the problem? So we have actually quite a few answers. Perhaps, the Gemara says, perhaps the non-Jewish person switched the milk of the cow for the milk of a camel or the milk of another non-kosher animal. Okay? And so the Gemara answers that cannot be. Why? Since, tells us the Gemara, tahor chivar, the milk of a kosher animal generally is very, very white, and tameh yarok, the milk of a non-kosher animal has a yellowish or greenish tinge to it. And so that tells us that it generally is not kosher. So we seem to have the Gemara telling us that you can sort of tell a little bit just by looking at the milk whether it's from a kosher or non-kosher animal. So then what is the concern? What we continue. So another answer, tells us the Gemara, is that maybe it could be that the non-Jewish farmer or business person, let's say, will take half the cow's milk and half the camel milk in this case, and then mix them together, and maybe you couldn't tell the difference. Okay? So the Gemara then contends and says to us, Nekum. What does nekum mean? Let's try to coagulate the milk. Try to coagulate and turn the milk into cheese. So that's the answer the Gemara is giving us. The question is, how does that prove if it's kosher milk or not? So the Gemara teaches us something really interesting. The Gemara tells us and teaches us that kosher milk can be coagulated and non-kosher milk cannot turn into cheese. Again, some principle of knowledge, and we're going to, we'll see if that really is the case. So the question is this so given today's veterinary science? Let's see if that's the case. According to Dr. Douglas Goth of Guelph University, one of the top veterinary schools in the world, he writes that the purpose of coagulation, why does milk coagulate in general, is that when a baby calf nurses, okay, it has to absorb all the nutrients from the milk that it drinks. So in order to provide enough time to absorb all the nutrients as the milk passes through the gastrointestinal system, the milk coagulates to slow it down. Okay? Good evening, Ron. So, and the question is, how does it coagulate? Good evening, Ron.
Hi.
And the question is, how do we just started? How does the milk coagulate? Well, in the baby calf's stomach, there are two enzymes known as chymosin and renin or pepsin. And then as the enzymes react with the milk contains a protein called casein, which we're all pretty familiar with. And when the enzymes react with the milk casein, the molecules of the casein solidify, and that slows down the milk and allows the calf to absorb all the nutrients from the milk. So the question is, what about non-kosher milk? It should also have casein in it, and it also should coagulate, we would think. How can the Gemara tell us that it's going to be different from kosher milk? So there are several halakha authorities that discuss this issue. The Ritva, Rabbi Yom Tov ibn Avraham Asevili, who lived around 1250 to 1333, he writes in his commentary on the Gemara of Masechet Avodah Zarah, he writes, Lav de'eno omed klal, meaning the Gemara did not mean that non-kosher milk doesn't coagulate at all. Ella, he says, sherubo eno omed, uberubo na'aseh nasyube. He says most of the milk, when you try to coagulate non-kosher milk, like camel's milk, most of it remains liquid. So therefore, to test for kosher milk, if it becomes solid, it's kosher. And if it doesn't, maybe it's not kosher. That's the implication so far. The Radbaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra, another halachic authority, he writes and tells us that non-kosher milk is not going to solidify into a hard consistency like a block of cheese. So basically, you could make yogurt or soft cheese from non-kosher milk, but you can't make hard cheese. That's what he says. So far, so good. Are we okay? I know we're sort of in the reeds here, in the weeds. We're gonna sort of find our way through the forest. Okay. So the question is, getting back to our Gemara, what is the concern? What's the issue here? The Gemara says, you don't want it for a block of cheese. You want, let's say you want the milk for a good glass of milk, to put in your cereal or to make a dip out of it or something. So how do you know if it's going to be kosher milk or not? Answers the Gemara, Venishko mine kali venikum, meaning take a little bit of the milk and make a little bit of cheese from it to test. Okay? The Gemara answers, this won't work. Why? Because even in kosher milk itself, there's a little portion when you coagulate that remains liquid, and so therefore you can't really tell if it's kosher or not based on this test. Okay, so the question is, what portion of milk doesn't coagulate? That's the whey portion, right? When you the whey that's left out, that does not coagulate. So the bottom line here so far is that you can never tell if there's a mixture of non-kosher milk in a mixture of milk or not. You can't tell. Okay, so the Gemara concludes and takes it a step further and tells us, even if you want to make cheese with the whole thing, the whole admixture of milk, even then it'll be a problem. Why? Because there's liquid non-kosher milk that gets trapped in the air pockets of the block of cheese. You never see a block of cheese like Swiss cheese has little holes in it. It's inevitable you're going to still have some bits of milk that are stuck inside these pockets, and that might be where the non-kosher milk gets trapped in when it solidifies and made into a hard block of cheese. So again, not a very, very practical and not a very proven good test to use. Okay, so we're going to do a slight tangent about making cheese, and cheese is made by a non-Jew. So there are two separate issues here. The first one is the concern of eating or drinking cheese made by a non-Jew due to the possible mixture of non-kosher milk in it. That's one concern. The second chapter of the Gemara, Avodah Zarah, specifically prohibits the consumption of cheese that is manufactured by non-Jewish sources. And the question is why? And there are four reasons. The first one is that cheese that is made by a non-Jewish person, even if the ingredients are kosher, was forbidden. And since in those times, again, let's think back to the times of the Gemara. We're talking about the Middle East in general, Middle Eastern landscape, the environment. So in those times, it was very common for snakes to crawl around. Like we see squirrels crawling around today, there were snakes crawling around as well, especially in the evening and the nighttime when everyone's sleeping. So these snakes would crawl around neighborhoods, and they might deposit their venom into the non-Jews' milk, poisoning the milk or poisoning the cheese that might be made from it. So the Gemara gives a blanket for prohibition. You cannot have cheese that is made by a non-Jew, even if the ingredients are kosher, because of this risk of snakes and the deposit of venom into the milk. Okay, we've always been particular. The Gemara tells us about covering our foods, covering our liquids. It was not the case in other cultures or in other communities. Where things would just be open. It would be open, left out in the open, and whatever would happen would happen. Second reason why the Gemara specifically prohibits cheese that is manufactured by non-Jews is because there's a concern that the non-Jewish individual will coagulate the cheese with some sort of a catalyst or an enzyme such as vinegar that is made from wine that is forbidden. Okay, so they might take wine that is used in libation for idol worship, and then that becomes sour, it turns into vinegar, and it might be used as a catalyst that can be used as an enzymatic catalyst to make cheese. Third reason is the concern that they would use. Again, you need to have some sort of a sort of environment to coagulate the cheese, to the milk, so the milk starts to form and solidify, and you need those enzymes. One of the easiest ways they used to do it in ancient times was basically to take the skin from the stomach of a calf that had these enzymes in it, and which is not kosher, was not slaughtered kosher, or was not used kosher, and it's placed inside the milk, and that causes the cheese to form, to coagulate. Okay, that's another concern. And the fourth, we said that the cheese might have in it, in the holes of the cheese, liquid milk from non-kosher animal if there was a mixture of the two. Okay, so those are really the four reasons outlined in the Gemara as to why cheese made from non-Jewish sources is prohibited. Any questions so far? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
How can the snake tell who's Jewish and who's not?
No, it cannot. You're right.
Otherwise, that would be like who's a Jew would be a good way to solve that problem.
100%. So generally speaking, the Gemara talks about the importance of covering foods and covering liquids overnight. So we're not allowed to have, for example, food that's left out overnight or placed. It was very common in ancient times to store food or foodstuffs under a bed. That would be like a nice little storage area. So the Gemara talks about not placing foods or storing foods under the bed, and not having foods that are galui, that are exposed, overnight, and not consuming those. So that difference, you're right. So in that case, our food would be more stored, more hermetically sealed, whereas in other cultures or non-Jewish cultures, it's not really a prohibition or not really a concern.
But that assumes that all Jews always follow that, and that non-Jews never follow or may not follow that.
You're right. So at least in ancient times, maybe that was more the case. Perhaps in ancient times, maybe not today as much. That you're correct on that point for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So Rashi tells us on that Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Tractate Avodah Zarah 35a, that you cannot have cheese without little pits of milk inside the cheese. So again, you have this leftover milk that doesn't coagulate. So the question is, so what? And milk that was milked by a non-Jew and which a Jew did not wash is prohibited, since maybe there's non-kosher mixed in there. So the conclusion here is the following. One cannot eat non-Jewish cheese either because we're worried about the snake venom, or it's coagulated with non-kosher enzymes, or it's coagulated with non-kosher vinegar, or maybe some non-kosher milk was left over inside the cheese when there was a mixture of kosher and non-kosher milk. So those are pretty much the reasons when it comes to cheese. Okay. Now, Tosfot, which is the grandchildren of Rashi, and they tend to have nice arguments with Rashi with their grandfather. They said really, the only reason of all these reasons, the only reason was really the worry over snakes at the time. In other words, there really was nobody making cheese that would use non-kosher milk, since the production is really non-efficient. It's very limited. You wouldn't get a good yield from non-kosher milk because of the coagulation factor. All right, and the reason for the prohibition is really not a decree that requires nullification. So, and that's what talks about that. There were places in the world where they would use plant-based enzymes to coagulate the milk that have these properties, as a catalyst to cause cheese to form. So based on Tosfot, you would, if you know that the non-Jewish person is using, let's say, plant-based compounds to coagulate the milk, and you know that there are no snakes around, and there's no chance of non-kosher milk mixing in it, then really there is no problem to eat cheese made by a non-Jewish, company or factory. Okay, so today, and again, this answer is only theoretical. There are other issues of kashrut today. So for example, there's a tendency to keep the curds and they grind them back. Any of it that was used in non-kosher cheese production, and that's added. Enzymes, the enzymes that are used have to be kosher as well. That's another factor. All right. So that's the Tosfot's opinion, and it really isn't the final ruling, but it's very important to bring that in. The Rashba, who was a contemporary from 1235 to 1310, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, he disagrees with Tosfot, and he tells us that this prohibition of cheese, again, assuming that everything is kosher and there's no snakes around, this prohibition is part of those decrees of what is forbidden to eat as outlined in that second chapter of the Gemara of Masechet Avodah Zarah. And these decrees, he says, were established by the Sanhedrin, the Great Rabbinical Assembly. And of course, you may hear this many times when rabbis give talks in halacha, any decree that is passed by a court of significant number and stature, says the Rashba, even if that reason is not really relevant today, it can only be overturned by a rabbinical court of equal or greater number and stature, and it can't be repealed just because it's not relevant. All right, so you have that general principle there. So here we have a classic disagreement between the Tosfot, the grandchildren of Rashi, and the Rashba. And the Shulchan Aruch comes along, the code of Jewish law, and the final ruling does follow the Rashba. That's the ruling that we follow. Says the Shulchan Aruch, officially speaking, in the code of Jewish law, in the section Yoreh De'ah, section 115, regulation 2, the cheese made by non-Jews is prohibited because they used to make the milk coagulate by putting it in non-kosher animal skin, like an intestinal skin. And even if they use plants that are kosher to coagulate the milk, it is still forbidden to eat that cheese. So the take-home message with cheese is the following. Any cheese that has a reliable kosher certification ensures that there was some Jewish presence at the time that the milk was coagulated, okay? Now, it is a bit of a disagreement among later authorities whether a Jew has to actually put the enzymes in the milk themselves or has to just watch the process of the enzymes being placed. I worked for 2 years in a cheese factory about 2 hours outside of Toronto in Kitchener, Ontario, and they were very particular about me placing the enzymes in the big vat of milk to start the process of cheese making. Today also, microbial rennet is used, and that's genetically engineered microorganisms that are produced in a lab to coagulate the milk, okay? So for example, you'd only need like 15 milliliters of this microbial rennet to coagulate 1,000 pounds of milk, for example. Like that, that's the numbers we're talking about here. And it could take anywhere between 36 minutes up to like 36 hours, depending on the type of cheese that you wanted to get out of it. Okay, so the question that comes up now that we've spoken about hard cheese is, what about soft cheese? Is there a difference with soft cheese? Cottage cheese, for example, cream cheeses, yogurts, okay, they have a different texture, and perhaps the halacha is different. And so, and the question is why? Today, we see that, for example, cottage cheese has an OUD on it, and it is probably not a Jewish person that is curdling the cottage cheese. And we know that it's the policy of the OU, for example, to allow cottage cheese made by a non-Jewish person to be kosher. So the question is, how is this? And so the answer is the distinction is based on the fact that in cheese making, really, there are 2 types of cheese. There's the hard block of cheese, right? And then there's also the soft cheese. And there's a difference in how the 2 are produced. Harder cheeses are more a rennet set. So that's enzymatic process. Soft cheeses are what are called acid set, which means there's some sort of acid fermentation of the milk that produces the soft cheese. And Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the later halachic authorities, he writes that the only decree in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that prohibits the cheese of a non-Jew is the hard rennet type cheeses. For that, there has to be some Jewish participation. But for soft cheeses, it's not included in this decree. So that's where you have that difference between soft cheeses like cream cheese and cottage cheese and the harder cheeses, the blocks of cheese. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's get back to milk now that we've sort of gone through the valley of cheese. Okay, so the question is, does this decree apply to milk? Is it relevant? Does it matter if it's relevant? So the Radbaz, David Ben Zimra, was asked. Here's the question. I'm going to pose it to you. Milk that was milked by a non-Jewish person, when a Jewish person is not watching the milking process, but you know for sure that there are no non-kosher animals around at all on the farm. And the bottom line is that you didn't see the actual milking of the cow. So the question is the milk forbidden or not? What is the halacha? And do we say that the decree is still in force? So the answer he gives is the following. He says it's clear that only cheese was prohibited by the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, based on the reasons given at that time, but not so by milk milked by a non-Jewish person. So if you're certain that it came only from a kosher animal, you should be able to drink it. And the proof he brings down, the Radbaz, is based on that Gemara in Avodah Zarah, when the Mishnah said that milk that was seen by a Jew is permitted. The Gemara knew that already. So why? Because we see it's written in a piece of the Gemara called the Braita that the Jewish person can sit by the yard of the farm of the non-Jewish person, have his his recliner chair over there, and the non-Jew can milk the cow for you and bring you that milk, and you don't have to worry about that milk. Enjoy. So the Gemara asks why. The Gemara asks if there's no non-kosher animal in the non-Jewish person's farm or yard, then it's obvious you can drink that milk, even if it was milked by a non-Jewish person. So, and again, even if there are no non-kosher animals on the farm, and from your position, were you to stand up, you can see what's being done. And when you're sitting down, you cannot see what's being done. You might think that right now in your sitting position, since you can't see what's going on, the milk is prohibited. And maybe at that point, it was switched with non-kosher milk. The Gemara says, no, that's not a factor. Why? Because the non-Jewish person knows that if you stand up, you can see what's going on, and he'll be afraid to pull any tricks. There's this idea, of mirtat, that he's not going to basically pull any tricks all of a sudden because he knows you're there. All right? So we have this amazing Gemara that tells us two things. One, if you know that the non-Jewish farmer has no non-kosher animals on the farm, then of course you can drink the milk. And two, even if there are non-kosher animals on the farm, the fact that at any given moment you might stand up and see the farmer when they're doing their milking process, that is enough of what's called an intimidation tactic, for example, that there won't be any tricks pulled. So the Radbaz concludes, and he says, clearly from this Gemara, from this Talmud, that where you know that the non-Jewish farmer has no non-kosher animals there, you're allowed to drink the milk that is milked from his cows. Comes along the Pri Chadash, Rav Chizkiyahu de Silva, from the late 1600s, and in his commentary on the Code of Jewish Law, and he writes, further, the application of this in a city where in a city now, where you know that there are no non-kosher animals, or if you know that non-kosher milk is more expensive than cow's milk, then there's no reason that the non-Jewish farmer would put non-kosher milk in the container, and based on that, you are allowed to buy the milk that the non-Jew milked himself without any Jewish supervision, okay? And this was, in fact, the custom in the community of Amsterdam, okay? But he says, in a city where there is non-kosher milk, I don't know, whatever it is, then you must ensure the milk is under Jewish supervision, okay? The Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, from 1762 to 1839, he writes, and he disagrees with the position of the Pri Chadash. And he writes that milk that was not milked under Jewish supervision is actually a decree that one cannot consume it, regardless of the reasons, whether relevant or not. So he goes back to the original Gemara, and he says, no, it's a decree from the Gemara. We don't touch it. It's got to be supervised, okay? And he proves from sources that we treat milk as a decree that must be enforced anyway. And he quotes, even if you want to assume that the decree is not relevant anymore, the bottom line is that the custom has always been to drink what is called Chalav Israel. Okay? All right? And he says a custom, a minhag, carries the stringency of a Torah prohibition. That's how strong it is. It's not just a custom anymore. It has this strength of historical strength. And he says that the decree is as strong as a rabbinical prohibition. So the Chatam Sofer holds that the decree is still in effect. It's a rabbinical prohibition, and it's a custom to drink only Chalav Israel. Thus, it would be a Torah prohibition to change that, since one is violating the minhag or the neder or the oath, the vow that was made to drink only Jewish milk, so to speak. Okay, coming out to more contemporary authorities. The Chazon Ish, Rav Avraham Karelitz, he writes in his commentary on the Jewish Code of Law on this subject. He says that the status of milk that is subject to the scrutiny of governments, such, for example, that the government fines the producer of the milk, or any dairy farms that might adulterate the milk and mix in non-kosher milk. He says that the milk is permitted based on two factors. One, the government supervision may be comparable, he says, to a Jewish person who performs spot checks, and so therefore the producer fears adding in non-kosher milk. And 2, there really is no practical concern that non-kosher milk will be added. The opinion of the Pri Chadash is added as a sort of mitigating factor to permit the milk, since it's not really common to find non-kosher milk in the market these days. Rav Moshe Feinstein, in his responsa, Igrot Moshe, he writes that aside from the opinion of the Pri Chadash, Rav De Silva, regardless of decree in effect or not, and regardless of no available, non-kosher milk or not, he says, what is really the requirement of Israel? You can see the milk so that you know that it was kosher milk. That's really the requirement. You have to see that it was kosher milk. So if you have certainty, then it's just as good as if you saw it. In other words, he equates yedi'ah to re'iyah, right? The knowledge of the milk status is equal to having supervised it, having seen it, okay? So therefore, he writes, since today, in his first early responsa, he writes, since today, since there is government regulation, and then in America it's FDA regulations, for example, there's supervision, there are visits, there are fines that are that are enforced to ensure there's no other mixture than chalab. He calls it chalab hakompanis, the milk of the companies, dairy companies. He says it's treated as if it's chalab Israel. And he concludes that one who wants to be lenient has what's called ta'am gadol to do so. He has a big reason to rely on that if he needs to. However, he says, and he ends off that responsa with very, very important words. He says, Ba'aleh nefesh min hara'ui lehachmir. Spiritually sensitive people, it's spiritually sensitive individuals, it is fitting to be strict. And he himself, the Rav Moshe Feinstein, was also very strict in the matter. So I think it's a very important, very important ending to his responsa in the sense that I know that Stan asked originally on Chalav Yisrael, for children, and we're going to get into that response as well from Rav Moshe Feinstein, that we're talking here about a lot of, technicalities and watching and not watching and non-kosher milk and kosher milk and Jewish involvement and non-Jewish involvement. Again, we have to sort of to come to this idea that we're also talking about, there's a spiritual effect here. Everything we do on the physical plane has a spiritual effect as well. That's what we believe. That's how we live our lives. We live our lives, in this world, in the Olam Hasiyah, as we call it, and we affect, and we have the spiritual connection with everything that we do. So the Chalav Yisrael is that's again, that interface between the physical and the spiritual. Now, in a later responsa, Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 1950s, he was asked about yeshivas, if they have to buy Chalav Yisrael for their students, or they should just, stock regular milk. Of course, kosher. We know that it's kosher, but not Chalav Yisrael. All right, not specific Jewish supervision. So he writes that even if it is more expensive, he says the yeshiva must buy Chalav Yisrael as it is part of the chinuch, as part of the education of yeshiva students to see how to be careful with all sorts of prohibitions and to understand, the importance of these things. In a later responsa in the 1970s, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that his leniency about this whole issue of Chalav Yisrael, he says it was really b'sha'at hadichak, meaning for a person during times of duress, in other words, someone who's out of town where Chalav Yisrael is not readily available, then at that point there is room to be lenient. Otherwise, he said, one should be strict with Chalav Yisrael. So we see that Meikar Adin, the essential halacha, again, as it's applied here, is it's not a problem. And he certainly held that it was appropriate and even advisable under many circumstances to be strict with the consumption of Chalav Yisrael. Now, what about powdered milk? It's very commonly used. You find a lot of products on the market today have milk ingredients or milk powder or things like that. Even in Israel, there's a lot of powdered milk that's imported from the U.S. to Israel. It has a long shelf life. It's used in bakery products. Where do we hold with that? So the Chazon Ish writes that, again, where there is government supervision on the milk to prevent any adulteration, he says, Yesh makom lomar, you can say you don't need Chalav Yisrael per se when there is government supervision. And again, that ruling was a subject of controversy in later generations. For example, the Shevat Halevi, or Vosner in 1952, he did not agree with that leniency. Chavav Yosef, he permits the use of powdered milk. However, where it is advisable or where it is available, he says, it is appropriate to drink and eat Chalav Yisrael only. So to conclude this sort of section of Kashrut and our connection to Chalav Yisrael, we talked about two different reasons The reason for the 2 decrees in the Talmud, the reason to prohibit milk that was not milked under Jewish supervision, and the reason to prohibit cheese that was not made under Jewish supervision. We also said practically cheese that's made by a non-Jewish individual, not supervised by a Jew. If it's hard cheese versus soft cheese, there's a difference there. We talked about milk, the relevancy of the decree of the Radbaz and the Pri Chadash of Chizkiyahu de Silva, and we talked about government regulations with stringencies, if it's available at that point. So that concludes the kosher aspect of our talk this evening on milk and whether it does the soul good. Okay, any questions? Okay, so let's get into, since we're talking about milk, we want to talk about dairy. And the question is really, it does, as the saying goes, does milk really do the body good, as that marketing slogan went in the old days of milk? And first, I want to start in the spirit of agreement. All nutrition experts, that are seriously interested in promoting health and longevity, they agree that eliminating processed foods, that are rich in salt, oils, refined flours, and added sugars, including sugar-sweetened beverages, and replacing them with properly prepared whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and legumes, enjoyed with water, with coffee also has a place, or tea. That really is the foundation of all dietary sort of patterns that are supported by the overwhelming majority of science. Like, that's the overwhelming majority of science. So, we can all put our hands together, we can sing Kumbaya or We Are the World or whatever you want, and everyone agrees in that. Past that, however, the areas of disagreement, and we touched upon it last week with animal-based proteins, with meat, really the area of disagreement centers on the amount and the sourcing of animal products, if any, that have a place in a healthy diet. One area of contention has been dairy, butter also in particular, and a few years ago, I think it was on the cover of Time magazine, that butter came back as a health food. I think there was a time not too long ago where they were talking about bulletproof coffee, where you have your coffee with a pound of butter in it, type of thing, to give you that health boost or whatever the case is. Okay, so we're going to talk about the health impacts of butter, of dairy products. It's important to note that today, Americans consume an enormous amount of dairy in general. All my stats are sort of American because they're easier to find. The intake of the average American is estimated to be over 600 pounds of dairy products per year. Okay, so yeah, quite a bit. Okay, and of course, we also have incredible marketing by the dairy industry, that reinforces this broadly ingrained belief that dairy is good for our health. The question is it really? And dairy in general has come under fire and scrutiny from nutritional experts, scientists, and physicians for its association with a number of health issues, which we're going to get into this evening. Okay, so the first thing is the inclusion, unfortunately, of hormones in milk. And even organic milk usually contains hormones. Okay, dairy is a significant source of female hormone exposure. Commercial cow's milk contains large amounts of estrogen and progesterone, which is a serious concern. Okay, and this is even more exacerbated by modern day cows that are basically being genetically altered to continuously produce milk, even throughout their repeated pregnancies. Okay, so even milk that is labeled organic or no hormones added usually contain high levels of these problematic hormones, which are naturally produced by cows, even if these cows have not been given additional hormones for the purposes of the product label. Okay, so in both adults and children, milk consumption has resulted in again, markedly increased levels of these hormones, estradiol and progesterone, in the blood and urine. And dairy consumption also in general has been associated with increased levels of circulating estradiol, another hormone. Now, the data show that men who drink milk will absorb the estrogens in the milk, which have been found to result in significantly decreased testosterone production levels as well. Okay, so there's already an imbalance that's occurring. Pediatricians have expressed concern regarding childhood exposure to just basically what are called these exogenous estrogens in commercial milk. Okay, why? Given studies that show that, showing that there's early sexual maturation in prepubescent children that can be caused by just the ordinary intake of cow's milk. Okay, and there is a ton of good what's called multi-centered, peer-reviewed studies that show that dairy consumption is one of the most concerning and consistent factors for hormone-dependent malignant diseases or cancers, including ovarian, uterine, breast, testicular, and prostate cancers. Okay. Now, also, we should say, while there is, a culturally popular idea that soy foods may also cause a feminizing effect, because they may have this estrogen-like effect on the body as well. Several studies have found that, those compounds called isoflavones that are found in soy foods, okay, they don't exert the feminizing effects on men, even at high consumption levels. And there were other studies that have found that soy food consumption is even protective against breast cancer. So, I think it's really important to be far more concerned about, high levels of real hormones found in dairy, the consumption of which results in measurably higher circulating levels of these problematic hormones. So that's the hormone story when it comes to milk. Okay, something to be aware of. Now, casein from dairy. Casein, we know, casein is the main protein in dairy. And studies have shown that it facilitates the growth and development of cancer, unfortunately. In fact, actually, some studies have found that that cancer development could be controlled more by casein levels in diet than by exposure to any sort of underlying carcinogen or something that causes cancer. We talked about insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, last week. It's a hormone that promotes cell growth and division in both normal and cancer cells. And that's thought to be one of the mechanisms responsible for this association. This IGF-1 appears to be nutritionally regulated, and animal protein consumption, including casein from dairy foods, leads to higher circulating levels of this sort of cancer-promoting hormone. So for this reason, consuming casein from dairy, as well as animal protein in general, is associated with, again, an increased risk of development of cancer and its proliferation. Okay. The third risk we're talking about here is there's a higher risk of type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis. Okay. Our immune system normally protects us from microbes and other harmful substances. But if it loses its ability to recognize and distinguish harmful substances from normal tissues and cells, it can start to mount an attack against our own bodies. Okay? These auto attacks, or called autoimmune disease, for example, can be triggered by exposure to what are called foreign peptides, including animal proteins fragments that are found in dairy, okay? And because they have similarities to components in the human body, and this can result in our immune system becoming confused, so to speak, and misidentifying tissues in our body as foreign, and thus in need of being attacked and destroyed. So dairy is associated with an increased risk of several immune-related disorders, okay? Everything from allergic conditions to autoimmune disease, many being life-changing and difficult to treat. There's an association with type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis are actually particularly concerning, okay? With type 1 diabetes, or juvenile diabetes as it's called, the immune system attacks the pancreas, resulting in the body no longer being able to produce insulin or regulate glucose, okay? And there have been multiple large-scale studies that have sort of identified an association between cow's milk consumption and the increased prevalence of type 1 diabetes, okay? There was actually one study that actually found that cow's milk may contain even a triggering factor for the development of type 1 diabetes. Multiple sclerosis, or MS as it's called, in the immune system attacks the insulating sheath of our own nervous system, resulting in a variety of difficult to treat and unpredictable neurological problems. So just like type 1 diabetes, there are studies that report that cow's milk consumption, it may be a risk factor for developing MS as well. Now, what about microorganisms? Milk contains microorganisms. It contains, different virus, bacteria. So even pasteurized milk contains microorganisms. Milk and other dairy products are important vehicles for what are called foodborne pathogens or foodborne bacteria due to a variety of microorganisms that they harbor. And even with modern sanitation requirements like pasteurization and curing, there are still outbreaks that occur. Whether it's salmonella, listeria, whether it's E. coli, these are some of the more common foodborne outbreaks associated with dairy. I think just a couple of years back, there was 3 people tragically died, I have here, from listeria infections linked to a certain ice cream brand that was recalled. Okay, so again, I don't know whether there's merit to saying, and I've heard this before, even when I was at a sort of dairy farm not too long ago. One of the older elderly owners of the dairy farm, he'd actually come, right after the milk was milked into the vat, he'd put it in a container and take it home. He'd say, "This is how I drink my milk. I don't do it pasteurized. I don't do anything. This is how I drink it." Maybe there is some merit to that because you still have other the healthier nutrient factors that are in it when it's fresh from the cow. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe that, and maybe there isn't. I don't know. But for the most part, there is some association with these microorganisms that are dangerous that are still in there even after pasteurization occurs. Okay, dairy products also accumulate pesticides in high concentrations. Okay, we know that exposure to what are called organochlorine pesticides is another problem that's associated with dairy. Okay, while pesticide contamination affects water and agricultural lands in general, the dairy products have a greater capacity to accumulate these pesticides in higher concentrations due to the high fat content. So that sort of stores it in there. And even pesticides that have long been banned still show up when dairy products are tested, whether it's like these organochlorine pesticides, DDT, for example, was banned as a carcinogen, it still seems to persist in the environment and accumulates very easily in the fat content of milk. Okay. In India, milk and other dairy products like cheese and butter have been reported as major sources of these pesticides. Okay, and routine monitoring detected that milk from dairy farms in in certain regions of Italy also had high levels, 20 times higher than legitimate limits. Okay, that are still there in the environment. Okay. Now, we know also that there's an increased exposure to antibiotic residue. The largest use of antibiotics worldwide is for livestock. That's known. And much of that use is for non-therapeutic purposes. In other words, for example, to prevent infection and to promote the efficiency of feeding and animal growth. So apart from the dire warnings from scientists that agricultural overuse is leading to antibiotic resistance, another problem is that antibiotic residues persist in milk and other dairy products despite sort of protocols to minimize this. And it's difficult to prevent and control these antibiotic sort of leftovers or residues from individual cows and farms, that are pulled together. Okay, so that's also a big problem. So the resulting low dose antibiotic exposure can lead to a variety of problems. From, again, the biggest one being antibiotic resistance that we face in our day more often than we have before. Okay, allergic reactions, side effects, and these type of things. Okay, dairy, we know, seems to be connected, or we've been taught to believe that it may affect our bone health on a positive level, but it also can actually lead to bone problems as well. And it can come as a surprise. Not only basically is there a good body of scientific evidence found that there actually is inadequate to support the idea that dairy consumption promotes bone health. There isn't enough good evidence to show that it does. There actually are some large-scale studies that have found that consuming dairy products may actually be detrimental to bone health. There's a link between higher milk intake and significantly increased risk of bone fractures, there seems to be. And again, there are several mechanisms that are thought to be responsible sort of for this. One is the high calcium content, which can cause a dysregulation of vitamin D, and therefore it disrupts basically the balance, or what's called the homeostasis in bone. Another mechanism is that high animal protein content of dairy can induce what's called this acidosis. The body leaning towards more of an acid state from its high proportion of we said last week, sulfur-containing amino acids. And that in turn leads to the body compensating by leaching calcium from bones to help neutralize the acidity. Okay, so over time, all this can also be detrimental to bone health. Now we know, for example, that there are other factors like physical activity that affect bone health. It's important to note that one of the United States in particular has one of the highest rates of hip fractures in the world, despite our high milk intake. The U.S. is high milk intake, I should say. Okay. By contrast, countries like Japan and Peru, where the average daily calcium intake is as low as 300 milligrams per day, and that's basically less than a third of the American daily recommendation for adults. The incidence of bone fractures is actually quite low. Okay, so it's good to know at least that calcium is abundant in plant foods, especially leafy green vegetables, legumes, seeds, often with good and higher absorption rates than calcium in dairy, and of course without any of the associated dairy health problems that will come with dairy. That's my plug for plant-based right now. Okay. There is an association with decreased insulin sensitivity. Consuming dairy actually may reduce the sensitivity of insulin in people with what are called a pre-diabetic state called metabolic syndrome. Okay, and that basically the dairy might impact the ability of people to regulate their blood sugar properly, which leads to another whole problem of risk factors when it comes to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and heart disease and obesity and hypertension. Okay. Definitely, the full fat dairy, a lot of studies where there was full fat in dairy groups had more of a negative effect on the body than a positive effect. And in general, insulin sensitivity helps the body use sugar or glucose more effectively, and that keeps blood sugar with levels within a healthy range. Decreased insulin sensitivity, also known as what's called insulin resistance, means that the body is less able to effectively use glucose. And with that, over time, there's basically elevated blood sugar and type 2 diabetes and other diseases. Okay, so definitely, there is some sort of connection between the consumption of milk and the problem with insulin being able to be used effectively in the body. Okay, now what about butter? So, again, butter has been associated in general with higher risk for cardiovascular disease and heart-related mortality risks. Okay, there was a sort of a group of 3,349 subjects who were basically free of diabetes at baseline. They were tracked for more than 4 years, and those with the highest intakes of saturated fat and animal fat had the greatest risk for developing diabetes in their follow-up. Okay. Consuming just one daily serving of butter and cheese was associated with a higher risk of diabetes. So, that's the connection there. There was also another controlled study that showed that butter had an impact on heart disease risk as well. Okay. The high fat, high sugar diets were linked to more depression. A study of 5,000 adults in, a Dutch research study showed that this connection as well. So, we have all these connections here, and, every species of mammal produces milk for its own babies, and the content of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and minerals is specific to provide optimum nutrition for a baby of that particular species. The milk from an elephant, a tiger, a sea lion, and a cow are each different from one another, and they're all different from human milk as well. Okay, when we think about it, the health problems that come from continuous consumption of dairy products, it shouldn't really be a surprise. And I say this to everybody, especially to my patients that come to see me, and I see this in the Jewish community more so than other communities. We seem to lose the ability to assimilate and to digest pretty much dairy as we get older. It seems to be a little harder on the system, a little more difficult, and so we lose that enzymatic ability perhaps, and maybe because we don't need it. And it's there when we're younger, for development, or in the cases where nursing isn't an option, for example. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we still have that possibility, and we have that gift from Hashem that tells us that we can do that. But the good thing, I think it's important to know that, especially now in our day and age, we have so many plant milks, whether it's almond milk, rice milk, cashew milk, coconut milk, soy milk, all these sort of different versions, that it's really easy to not have to sort of rely so much on dairy. I have nothing to say for the person who tells me, but I want to have that slice of pizza once in a while. Okay, enjoy your slice of pizza, whatever risk comes with it, type of thing, But be aware, just be aware, and at the end of the day, yes, there is wisdom to everything in moderation. I do agree with that, but I also understand, Maimonides' principle that when we're faced with in a certain situation, sometimes we have to go to the extreme opposite of the situation to come back to some sort of balance in the middle. And I think maybe that's where our understanding and knowledge of dairy and some of the risks that it poses to our health is important to be aware of, as we age, especially as we age, and with all the chronic diseases that we're faced with in our society today. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
The milk that we're drinking right now, is it safe? Is it healthy? Is it?
After all that.
Yeah, I mean, it has everything. I mean, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, again, in general, milk has its risks, as we outlined, about 8 of them, and it's good to be important. I'll tell people, again, if you really want to know how your body's reacting to anything, eliminate it for a minimum of like 4 weeks at least. Eliminate that item, that substance, go without it, see how your body lives, see how your body reacts, replace it with other alternatives, and then after that, after those 4 weeks, those 3 or 4 weeks or 40 days roughly, put it back, introduce it back into your diet and see how your body reacts to it, and see, if you're still able to sort of assimilate it and digest it, or if your body now is telling you that, wait, I don't need this anymore. This is not good for me. I may have had. So we get our bodies used to things for so long that the body learns to sort of adapt. But now, if we take away something that may be harmful to the body, even though the body may have adapted to it and we never really reacted to it, now if we eliminate it and then reintroduce it back into our diet, and now the body's like, wait a second, I was free of this for a little while. That was a good life. Now you want to bring this back? That might not work so well for me anymore. So it says your body. So definitely, I would advise, give it a try. So eliminating dairy or milk. Try other milks, soy milk, almond milk, dairy milk. They're readily available, for about a month, and dairy in general, and see how your body reacts. Yes, Ron. So you're on mute.
Right. What about the effects of milk on chronic pain and or inflammation, which might
definitely
be,
yeah. There definitely is an association between, in general, animal-based proteins and increased inflammation in the body, and inflammation, is really front and center in medicine today, about the underlying cause of a lot of conditions, everything from pain, chronic pain, to cardiovascular disease, to autoimmune problems. There's this microinflammation that happens in the body, and definitely, animal-based proteins and dairy in particular do have an effect on inflammation. So if you're dealing with, whether it's arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or things like that, you want to sort of, again, do an elimination, eliminate the food, see how you do without it. Bring in other alternatives. Increase, again, hydrate. That was my first talk. Water. Keep your body hydrated, and then lean on the anti-inflammatory foods, such as ginger, for example, such as turmeric, such as garlic. Include those in healthy amounts. You want therapeutic amounts? Ask me later in private. We can talk about that as well. But definitely, include those as well when it comes to inflammation. And yeah, there is a big correlation between animal-based proteins and inflammation in the body.
Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. Okay. All right. Any other questions, guys? Hi, Stan.
Hi, sorry, I just worked late tonight, so I just joined. I didn't see the beginning, but I just wanted to ask you, one of the reasons I learned about the, meat and milk, is to create sensitivity. Like, not eating meat and milk together is a question about, learning how to be sensitive to, not bathing the calf in its mother's milk and so on. So if we had a, completely purav diet, we didn't have the animal proteins, we didn't have the dairy, we just had a purav vegetable-based diet, where does that leave us in terms of, our sensitivity? Is that
Okay, that's a great question. It's a great question, and I'll answer it with two. Well, I'll try. I'll give two answers in that area. The first one is, your question is an incredible segue to the next subject, which will probably be, mixing milk and meat. Are we allowed to, not allowed to, type of thing. So that's the perfect segue to, hopefully that'll be the next class. And secondly, I'll answer your question in the classic sense with another question. Have you ever seen a cow who eats grass all day long that is fights and is aggressive? So in other words, again, we are what we eat. So we with that principle being also in a spiritual sense, that through the consumption of, or I guess through the avoidance as much as possible of animal-based proteins, and the consumption of plant-based proteins, I think in general we achieve a level of calmness and sensitivity, spiritually speaking, as well. I think that seems to be, at least just empirically from that I've noticed. So sorry.
Certainly makes kashrut a lot easier.
Well, there's the bug issue, which is another class, and that's a crazy class too. But yeah, definitely.
You said sometime before, you said that Adam and Eve, originally they didn't eat meat until after the generation of Noah.
Yeah, that's a Rashi in Noach, in Parshat Noach. That's right.
So it would be something for our ultimate good, to strive towards, trying to get back to the level that, before the Mabul, before man had to start eating meat. You discussed different reasons why that was like sort of a lower level of their being, because they needed to have that, whereas before they didn't.
Definitely on an esoteric level, according to Kabbalah, we're always trying to get back to Gan Eden. In fact, after the neshama separates from the body, based on the actions of the individual in this world, they either merit to be in what's called Gan Eden Tachton, a lower level of Gan Eden, or Gan Eden Elyon, the higher level of Gan Eden. And on Shabbat, all souls in general ascend to that Gan Eden Elyon, that higher level of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. So yes, we are always striving to get back to that level, of the Garden of Eden, and that's pretty much our goal. And again, we're not trying to sort of. I think the overall arching idea also, and I'll say it again and again, if we are going to have animal-based proteins, it must be, especially as Jews, with that kavanah, with that intention, with that spiritual intention, especially on a Shabbat, on a Yom Tov, small amounts, a little bit of amounts, to really, really appreciate it and understand it. And we're taking this food, animal-based food, and we're elevating up to the highest level, in sort of in the chain of how creations ascend to the higher levels. We have sort of the plant-based world, and then the animal is eating the plants, and then it gets slaughtered ritually, properly, with good kavanot and proper and halachically, and then that's consumed by human beings, and it ascends to the next level, and then we in our actions bring it to the higher level. In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, that animal would go straight. It didn't have to go through these different processes. It went straight from one level all the way up to Shamayim, depending on the korban, depending on the offering that was offered. But that was one of the ways of sort of it's transcending to the next to the highest levels in one foul swoop, so to speak.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
You're welcome. All right. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.